Hello, my name is Christopher Lewis, and we are going to be talking about banking security. My part, I'll be talking about enhancing fraud detection, corporate account takeover, ATM fraud, and insider threat.
My name is Connor Eldridge. My parts will be DDoS attacks against banks, data breaches, spear phishing, and ransomware.
Enhancing systems for fraud detection. Banks are implementing data analytic tools to help build a strong fraud detection strategy. Customers have patterns when they're doing depositing, checking, and card transactions. These patterns can be used to determine possible fraudulent transactions. If a possible fraudulent transaction occurs, a hold can be put on the account until the account holder can verify the transaction. The analytic tools can also help determine attack patterns. Attackers have telltale signs that they are attacking. For example, attackers tend to test the limits of the amounts they are allowed to withdraw. A lot of transactions near the limit line is a good indicator of an attack. It will also help find relationships between attacks. Normal attack monitoring techniques are not enough because the attacks are becoming more complex. It also helps to minimize loss by having a faster response time. These, however, would have lots of overhead. As of now, the majority of institutions do not have the IT infrastructure to handle analyzing that much information. Another issue banks have to deal with is corporate account takeover. Corporate account takeover is when an attacker obtains access to your business account. When they gain access to this account, they can conduct unauthorized wire and ACH transactions, create and add fake names to the payroll, or steal customer information. Hackers obtain access to these business accounts by stealing account credentials. The way they do this is by phishing scams, mostly by email, or installing malware on an employee's machine and using keylogger to obtain this information. There are several things companies can do to protect themselves. Companies should educate their staff about safe practices and account takeover warning signs. Companies should also make sure that complex passwords are being used and changed often. They should also make sure that no employee is accessing accounts on an unprotected internet connection because the information can be intercepted in transit. They should also encrypt their sensitive data in case an attacker does get a hold of the sensitive data. The last thing they should do is keep their virus protection software up to date. It is also important for companies to detect if an account takeover has happened. Companies should regularly monitor their account activities for suspicious behavior at least once a day. Employees at the company should also be sensitive to the performance of their computers. The computer being slow can be an indicator that malware could be on the computer, taking up the computer's resources. The company should also run regular virus scans on their machines and pay close attention to the warning signs that the antivirus software is giving them. After a company has detected an account takeover, it is important for them to respond accordingly. First, the company should disable access to the accounts. Then they should change all the passwords to the online bank. If necessary, they may need to make new accounts and discard the old accounts. After all of that, they need to review all recent transactions and authorizations to see what the attackers have done. ATM fraud. To break it down in the most simple term, ATM fraud is withdrawing money from an ATM through illegitimate means. Criminals can use stolen bank cards or hack the ATM itself. There are 4 different types of ATM fraud. Skimming. This is where a device called a skimmer is placed on the outside of the ATM over the card slot to record the card information of the victim. The victim will not know if the card number was stolen until a transaction has occurred. The second kind is called shimming. This is similar to skimming, except for the device called a shimmer is not on the outside of the ATM, but it is on the inside of the ATM. That makes it harder for ATM user to detect. The third type is cash out. This is where an attacker drains an ATM of money using multiple stolen debit cards. It can also be from an attacker stealing a bank employee's credentials. This allows them to access multiple accounts and allows them to be able to withdraw unlimited funds. The fourth and final type is called jackpotting. This is similar to the cash out, but the attacker does not use stolen accounts or card numbers. Instead, the attacker gains physical access to the inside of the ATM machine. The attacker either has access to the hardware or installs malware into the ATM. This allows them to dispense money until the ATM is out. There are several ways for banking customers to avoid their accounts being used for ATM fraud. The first thing you can do is not to share your card or PIN number with anybody, even family members. The next thing is to examine the ATM you're about to use to make sure it does not look tampered with. If it looks tampered with, don't use it and notify the bank staff. Also be aware of other people using the ATM. If it looks like they are tampering with the ATM or if they are using multiple cards to withdraw funds, inform the police. Make sure to be aware of potential phishing sims trying to get your information and don't fall for it. Many banks offer additional security features. Be aware of what your bank offers and take advantage of the added security. View your account activity often for transactions that you did not authorize. Lastly, if your card is missing or you think your card information is stolen, call your bank right away. One thing every company has to face, including banks, is insider threats. I've included insider threats in here for completeness. An insider threat is someone on the inside of a company, in this case a bank, that can do harm to the system. Generally, an insider threat is harder to detect because the person that perpetrates it has access to the system. An insider threat can be done by someone who wants to do harm to the system, or can be done by an employee that's careless or is untrained in the company's cybersecurity policies. An example of how a careless employee can do harm is by falling for a phishing email scam that steals the employee's credentials. There are steps for any company can take to possibly mitigate an insider threat. One step is to make sure that the company's critical assets are protected. The next step is to document and enforce security policies in the workplace and enforce access controls on assets. The third thing to do is to mitigate negativity in the workplace. The less negativity in the workplace, the less likely you are to have a disgruntled employee. The last thing to do is to make sure to have a positive incentives for your employees to have goals that align with the company's goals.
DDoS attacks against banks. DDoS attacks against banks have been going on for more than a decade, but nowadays DDoS attacks on banks are not the end goal. Recently, according to ZDNet, a hacker organization calling themselves Silence have been making threats against banks in Singapore, South Africa, Turkey, and Australia. In a manner similar to ransomware, this group threatens to disrupt the services of banks unless they pay a ransom fee. Some banks that refuse to pay have been subsequently attacked, but not all. According to Bank Info Security, one other major use of DDoS attacks for hacker groups is a major distraction. While an attack is underway, such as fraud or ransomware, groups will attempt to DDoS the bank to tie up resources and shift focus away from the main attack. These kinds of attacks have become bigger and more frequent as technology and botnets grow to be able to send nearly 300 gigabytes of packets per second to shut down resources. Some banks have taken to third-party security firms to protect themselves, and some banks hire their own security teams, while many still have yet to catch up with security. On the side of DDoS threats, ZDNet recommends refusing the attacker's demands and contacting a security firm to set up a quick defense, as in most cases, a moderate defense is sufficient enough to hinder these kinds of attacks. If a bank is subject to a DDoS attack, Bank Info Security recommends to keep an eye on any other suspicious activity that may have happened while or just before services went down. Data breaches. Bank security involves more than just the bank's security. Many online services are connected with banks and through banks, such as PayPal or Amazon, with online accounts keeping data on purchases and credit card numbers. With so many interconnected accounts, cases of data breaches are more common as hackers only need to get into one system to get information they need. According to Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, data breaches can include theft of credit or debit card numbers, lost, discarded, or stolen documents, and mishandled sensitive information. It also stresses that data breaches do not necessarily mean identity theft in many cases, but identity theft is a much higher risk. The more people or organizations have your data, the more likely a data breach is to occur. From the bank's perspective, if their client is compromised, that can lead to breaches in their own system. Customers and clients play a role in bank security. For example, someone who has had their identity stolen through the data breach of another company could have the attacker using their information to mess with the account with the bank that in part can be a bank's fault if they can't stop it. Similar to insider threats, customers can be a way for attackers, albeit a little less of a risk than an insider threats for a bank, but a threat nonetheless. Spear phishing. Spear phishing falls under the category of an insider threat, but specifically accidental and unintentional. While many spear phishing attacks are mass-produced and given out as many recipients as possible, attacks against banks are more commonly sophisticated than most, requiring research and thought to be put into each email. For example, using names of coworkers and projects the victim is familiar with to make it seem more personal and believable. According to the Anti-Phishing Working Group, the APWG, specifically retailers and financial institutions are targeted far more than any other type of organization. However, within the last year, reported phishing attacks seem to have taken a dip globally. Strangely though, Brazil saw an increase in phishing attacks by more than 230% in 2019 alone. Many of these new sophisticated phishing attacks are using more sophisticated sites, their emails bring employees too, more convincing than before with SSL protection. As spear phishing becomes more sophisticated and attackers putting more effort into each email, even well-trained or educated employees can fall victim to attacks when emails include specific names of coworkers, names of current projects, and email addresses only just barely different from ones they know of their coworkers or bosses. So not only education and training is needed, but also reminders of this new sophistication to keep diligence up and look through even the small details and double check. Ransomware. Ransomware is an attack where data is stolen and encrypted, being held hostage by the attacker until the victim pays a ransom. In some cases, they even threaten to delete all of that data. According to American Banker, ransomware is becoming commonplace as software is developed to simplify the process for attackers, thus vastly increasing the number of attacks, although simpler ones. Targets of these attacks consist mostly of smaller businesses and banks that may not have the resources or manpower to fight it back efficiently. However, simple backups are usually enough to get services up and running within several hours to a day, but the sheer volume of attacks can overwhelm many of these small up-and-coming banks and businesses. In an article written by Bank Info Security, attacks since quarantine for the coronavirus began have raised new concerns for security in businesses. A recent attack on Cognizant has rendered their services unavailable for some time as they figure out how to keep their employees connected on personal devices outside the office building while dealing with security issues over a ransomware attack. Bank Info Security also interviewed cybersecurity specialists for their take on how security will work while so many work from home. The professionals brought up how often in an office environment, employees are heavily discouraged from using personal devices. But since no one can come into the office, many must rely on their personal devices to keep work going, and IT is struggling to keep up with this new environment. In some cases, simply having backups is not enough defense for ransom attacks anymore.